Hey guys, tonight we set sail together toward the rocky shores of Crete, an island whose soil remembers more than it reveals. Picture this: the sea around you, shimmering under moonlight gulls wheeling in the air, and a bustling harbour where merchants shout prices in tongues you barely recognise. Yet tonight we're not just talking about the Crete you know from travel brochures or glossy museum posters. We're diving into the Crete that history somehow misplaced a Crete, where entire communities pack up and vanish, leaving behind little more than silent ruins. And just so you know, if you were one of those unlucky folks back then, you probably wouldn't survive the boat ride out, never mind the earthquakes or invasions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time is it right now. Now find yourself a cozy seat or a soft bed. Let your mind begin to unwind. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Crete in its heyday is no sleepy backwater. It stands as a crossroads of Mediterranean trade, positioned neatly between the Greek mainland Egypt and the Levant. Ships glide into its harbours stacked with amphorae, full of olive oil and wine, while outbound vessels carry crafted goods, textiles and pottery. The Minoans, as the early Cretans are known, develop a sophisticated system of palaces, their walls painted with bright frescoes of dolphins, dancers and elaborate processions. Historians still argue whether these palaces serve primarily as temples, as administrative centres, or perhaps both. Imagine walking through corridors lined with images of bulls, sacred horns and rituals that may have left visitors wide-eyed in equal parts awe and confusion. One quirky tidbit that survives archaeologists uncovered jars of what looks suspiciously like cosmetic paste, possibly used as sunscreen, though not quite the coconut oil variety you'll find in beach bags today. The everyday life of Crete hums with activity. Farmers till soil rich with volcanic ash, planting barley and grapes, while shepherds guide flocks of sheep and goats across rugged hills. In the markets, traders haggle over bronze blades, jewellery and dyed cloth. But even in this apparent stability, cracks already begin to form beneath the surface, quite literally. The island sits in a geologically restless zone where the African and Eurasian plates nudge and grind. Crete's inhabitants live with the occasional jolt of an earthquake, sometimes mild, sometimes strong enough to topple pillars. Historians still debate whether one catastrophic quake delivers the first blow that sets Crete on a downward spiral. The sea itself offers both bounty and threat. Fishermen haul in nets heavy with tuna and squid, their catch salted and shipped across the Aegean. But the same waters carry raiders, pirates who eye Crete's wealth like bees drawn to honey. Legends speak of sudden attacks that leave villages smouldering and temples plundered. And while it might sound like a Hollywood script, ancient inscriptions from neighbouring lands confirm that Cretans are sometimes both the victims and the culprits of maritime raids. There's an almost mischievous irony there. Imagine a society famous for its seafaring, suddenly facing the possibility of fleeing across the same sea to save their skins. Amid this precarious balance, Crete maintains its identity through myth and ritual. The legend of King Minos, the labyrinth and the half-man, half-bull minotaur is more than just a story. It reflects the island's deep ritual connection with bull's power and sacrifice. Festivals echo through palace courtyards with acrobats leaping over bulls, in displays equal parts athletic and terrifying. Scholars continue to scratch their heads over whether such feats are ceremonial acts, entertainment or both. One fringe suggestion even imagines it as a form of initiation rite, though I'd personally have asked for a less horn-laden hobby. At night, Crete is never silent. Torches flicker in narrow streets, shadows stretch across palace stairs, and the distant rumble of the sea lulls the island to sleep. Yet beneath the calm there's an unease. Perhaps the elders whisper about the rumbling ground, or about foreign fleets spotted too close for comfort. Merchants may wonder if their next voyage will return empty if trade routes are shifting, or if the gods themselves are turning their faces away. By the time you picture this scene, it's easy to forget that within a few centuries or maybe even decades, this vibrant world begins to crumble. Entire neighbourhoods go quiet, palaces collapse into rubble, and the once teeming harbours look like graveyards of empty docks. What makes it even more haunting is the absence of testimony. We do not have the journals of ordinary Cretan families saying why they left or where they sailed. What we do have are the stone foundations, the broken pottery and faint echoes in Greek myth, hinting that something tremendous and tragic once unfolded here. So here we stand at the edge of Crete's forgotten chapter, a flourishing hub alive with art, ritual and commerce perched uneasily on a volatile land. It is the stage before the curtain falls, before tremors, storms and human fear conspire to erase a civilization's footprints. And as you settle further into comfort, remember that every bustling street, every painted dolphin, every market square could vanish overnight, leaving archaeologists thousands of years later to piece together what really happened. The ground under Crete never truly rests. Even on a morning that looks gentle, vineyards breathing in sea air, fishermen pushing narrow boats over pebbled shores, the island carries a low, hidden murmur. Floors quiver, doors rattle on their hinges, and clay jars tinkle like nervous bells. People here grow up understanding that stone can sway like a tree, and that a courtyard is safer than a painted room. They learn to sleep light sandals close by because a tremor is not a visitor that knocks. Historians still argue whether one overwhelming shock starts the long unravelling, or whether smaller stubborn jolts keep knocking the island off balance, until resolve simply wears thin. Crete stands along the great curve of the Hellenic arc, where the African plate slides beneath the Eurasian one. The sea looks soft, but the crust beneath it creaks buckles and flexes. In palatial centres, Knossos Maliophaistos archaeologists later find toppled staircases, walls, bowed like sails, and long corridors mended in awkward patches. A mainstream historical fact sits right there in the rubble. Entire wings are rebuilt sometimes more than once, which means these palaces do not suffer a bruise. They suffer fractures. The craftsmen who repaint dolphins and processions leave undercoats of plaster that show repairs like scar tissue. Each layer quietly admits, yes, the island shakes again. Across the water, a different force gathers the volcano on Thera. Modern Santorini builds pressure in a caldera that breathes in and out like a sleeping beast. When it finally blows in the mid-second millennium before the Common Era, the eruption punches ash into the sky, lofting it so high that winds carry the grit far beyond the Aegean. On Crete, pumice drifts pile along beaches and ash falls like grey snow. In some coastal pockets, archaeologists later find a dusting a few centimetres deep. Call it 2 to 3 centimetres, about 3/4 to 1, and 1/8 inches thin enough to sweep thick enough to sting crops. Inland, where ash settles lightly over fields, farmers cough through days that taste like stone. The sea itself turns treacherous. Waves rise in long breathing pulses, then withdraw so far that exposed rocks glisten like the bones of the coast. What follows is a wall of water, and not a poetic one. Along certain shores the rush may surge 10 to 15 metres high, about 33 to 50 feet, racing inland through low channels, leaving boats in vineyards and fish flopping in streets. Towns ringed by hills suffer less, flat harbours suffer more. In the disturbed sediments of some bays, marine sand later appears well above normal floodlines, and small sea creatures, diatoms and shells, end up where no tide should carry them. Salt bites into soil, and a season's harvest near the coast is lost. If you happen to be a merchant standing on a pier when that first strange drawdown occurs, you probably think, that is not how the sea behaves, and then you run. If you are wise, you run uphill. If you're particularly wise, you do not stop to save the amphora your cousin overfilled. Not every disaster announces itself with a spectacular headline. After the ash clouds fade and the great waves recede, aftershocks keep worrying the island like teeth on a thread. People jump at the gentle clink of hanging oil lamps. Children sleep outside. Priests lead brisk rituals to steady nerves. Libations poured at dawn. Bulls led to altars murmured prayers to Poseidon, shaker of the earth, and to Zeus, whose cave creeps through Cretan mountains. A few families tie small tokens to their doorposts, bits of bright cloth, a shell, a dull knife thought to cut misfortune because humans will always reach for a little luck. A light joke here, one father insists the knife must stay sharp to slice bad omens. His wife quietly uses it on cheese and assures him the gods prefer tidy wedges. Quirky tidbit, later Greek grooming treats pumice as a kind of exfoliating tool. After a volcano sends rafts of it bobbing along sea lanes, imagine islanders scrubbing their calluses while muttering that the gods have a sense of humour. The palaces try to return to ceremony. Musicians tune lyres, scribes tap fresh clay tablets, and storerooms smell of oil and barley. Pithoi, the enormous jars that line storerooms, can hold hundreds of litres, think 200 to 300 litres, or roughly 53 to 79 gallons, and the stewards track every measure because food is comfort and power. Yet a cracked storeroom is a sermon about fragility. Workers shore up pillars with new timbers, sometimes imported from across the sea. A beam needs to be long and strong, 8 or 9 metres, about 26 to 29 feet, and that is not something a carpenter pulls from a scrubby hillside. Timber means trade. Trade means the harbours must be quiet, the lighthouse braziers bright, the sailors sober enough to aim the prow. After the waves, none of that can be assumed. People notice other changes that creep rather than crash. Wells sour. Springs run cloudy for a season. Along the north coast, a marsh that never existed before begins to shimmer in summer heat, a puddled scar that draws mosquitoes and curses. Farmers mark a line beyond which barley no longer thrives, the salt line, and it lies a few hundred metres inland, say, 300 to 400 metres, roughly 980 to 1,310 feet, an invisible border inked by the sea. Families keep a mental map of safe fields and ruined ones, and every map grows smaller. Rumour moves faster than carts. A ship from the east limps in with cracked ribs and a crew who swear the horizon glowed like a second dawn. Shepherds tell stories about flocks that stampede just before the ground sighs. Someone claims the goats know the schedule of the earth. Gentle joke number 2, goats do not know schedules. Goats barely respect fences. Historians still argue whether such observations are post-disaster wisdom or folklore retrofitted to make sense of fear. But fear itself is practical. It reorganises habits. People store food near courtyards. They leave doorways unblocked. They sleep in shifts. They make little bundles, bread, a water skin, a small charm because a house is not a fortress if the ground beneath it behaves like a ship in rough water. When the shaking pauses, officials count damages and boast about repairs. They plan festivals to show that order stands. Dancers rehearse leaps over bulls, priests polish ceremonial cups, and the palace facade gleams again. Yet a fine crack remains in the painted wall, and everyone knows where it runs. The audience claps because clapping proclaims stability. The heart remains cautious. A worker who climbs the restored stair remembers the day those steps fell like teeth. A sailor who rows out through the mouth of the bay keeps glancing backward as if the sea has learned a trick. Scholars looking back try to stack the evidence ash layers that thin as they move south. Sand lenses where sand never should be, rebuild phases that follow seismic signatures. The pattern feels like a drumbeat: strike, recovery, shorter each time. Historians still argue whether the Thera eruption is the decisive blow or a brutal overture that weakens the island for later troubles, famine, raiders, political fracture. The truth may be less theatrical and more human, too many shocks within too few lifetimes. By twilight, the island does what it always does. It breathes. Fishermen check nets. Children chase shadows. Elders sit on thresholds and swap the same stories because repetition calms the night. A third light joke slips in as a whisper. One old man swears he can predict quakes by how his knees ache. His neighbour replies that his knees predict only rain and bad dancing. They both laugh softly because laughter is the one tremor that makes rooms feel safer. And still the earth below waits. Families keep their bundles packed a little tighter. Traders watch the seam of the horizon. A mother rests her palm on the wall and feels a ghost of movement, or maybe it is only her own pulse. Either way, the choice before them becomes clearer not because an oracle commands it, but because stone has spoken in a language everyone now understands. If the island refuses to hold still, people must. They will soon look to the harbours at dawn, and consider a map wider than their fields, measuring courage in oarstrokes and trust in the colour of the sky. Dawn breaks and the island wears an uneasy stillness. After weeks of tremors and nights spent outside, families begin to act on whispered plans that move from rumour to resolve. People do not shout the word Exodus in the open square, but you can see it in the way mothers set aside loaves, fathers patch sails, and elders stare at the horizon, as if measuring distances with their eyes. The decision to leave does not arrive in a single thunderclap. It creeps like ivy, wrapping itself around the routines of daily life until one morning the harbour looks different. Nets are rolled, but not for fishing. Jars are sealed, but not for storing. Instead, everything points toward the sea. Imagine the sight: a coastal village that usually thrums with trade suddenly swarms with families carrying baskets, bundles, and goats bleating in complaint. Ships are drawn up, some repaired hastily with planks that do not quite match. The smell of tar and fresh-cut wood mingles with smoke from breakfast fires that will soon go cold. Historians still argue whether these departures happen all at once in a grand flight or in waves, families slipping away quietly over months, perhaps years. Either way, the impression is clear: Crete, once a proud hub, begins to empty. Mainstream history notes signs of rapid abandonment. At sites like Gurnia pottery lies unfinished tools scattered as if workshops are deserted mid-task. This is not the careful winding down of a town. It looks more like a clock that suddenly stops ticking. Floors remain uncleaned hearths, unswept. In one storeroom, archaeologists find vessels toppled and never retrieved as though their owners left intending to return but never did. The silence in these rooms is louder than words. A quirky tidbit: in one abandoned house, a clay tablet with Linear A script is discovered partly baked by a fire. Scholars cannot fully read Linear A, so the last words left behind by that household remain locked. Was it a prayer? An account of trade? A hurried message? The irony is sharp. If the family did leave, their written voice lingers without translation, like a farewell that refuses to be spoken. Historians still debate whether such fragments represent hurried flight from disaster or a slower fade caused by economic collapse. On the beaches, the choreography of departure unfolds. Carts creak under the weight of storage jars, some massive pithoi, large enough to hold several hundred litres, think around 300 litres, or roughly 79 gallons. Men groan under the strain rolling jars onto waiting ships, where they are wedged with straw to prevent shattering. Children clutch dolls or carved animals, treasures that mean little to trade but everything to comfort. Women adjust shawls and coax frightened animals up gangplanks. It is a scene at once mundane and monumental, the everyday act of moving house, scaled up to an entire people shifting their ground. The harbours themselves tell stories. Inlets once filled with merchants haggling over wine and bronze now resound with the shouts of captains urging speed. A fisherman's boat built for nets, not journeys, is patched with extra planks, its hull lined with hides to make it more seaworthy. A merchant galley once bound for Cyprus now accepts passengers with desperate faces and half-filled purses. Somewhere a priest murmurs a blessing, pouring wine into the waves for Poseidon's favour. Whether Poseidon listens is, as always, uncertain. Not everyone departs willingly. Some elders refuse to leave the graves of their ancestors. Others cling to orchards that still bear fruit to sheep that cannot be herded aboard. His son argues with his father at the edge of the pier, the younger pleading for escape, the older muttering that Crete has shaken before and survived. Light joke number 1, a goat tied to a cart decides for itself, breaks free, and boards a ship uninvited, bleating triumphantly, as if declaring, "I am ready for adventure." People laugh, tension cracking like a brittle jar, but beneath the laughter lies fear. By midday the horizon begins to change. Sails dot the sea like white birds taking flight. Smoke from abandoned hearths thins in the breeze. Dogs bark at empty doorways. In one village, a pot boils dry on a fire, its lid rattling as if complaining that its owners forgot dinner. The island's song markets, festivals, hammers fades into a hollow quiet. What remains is wind gulls and the slap of waves against pilings that no longer serve. Historians still argue about the speed of this exodus. Some suggest it follows a single catastrophic event, tsunami, invasion, famine, that forces immediate flight. Others propose a drawn-out migration, with communities leaving one by one until palaces stand empty shells. Perhaps both are true. One town runs in a night. Another lingers for years until pressure builds again. What unites these theories is the recognition that a society once brimming with life thins, scattering its people like seeds across foreign shores. By evening, the coastline glimmers with fewer lights. Fires burn in clusters where families still hesitate, but the overall glow shrinks. Out at sea, lanterns sway on masts as ships rock gently. The water reflects twin images: the island that is left behind, and the flickering promise of a future somewhere else. A sailor leans on an oar and watches Crete retreat into darkness, wondering if he will ever see its cliffs again. Behind him, children huddle under cloaks, lulled to uneasy sleep by the rhythm of waves. In that moment, Crete becomes a memory in motion. It is no longer only a place, it is a story. People carry a weight heavier than jars of oil or baskets of grain. And for those who stay, silence grows heavier than stone. The soil of Crete does not just grow olives and barley. It keeps secrets pressed and hidden, waiting for someone centuries later to kneel in the dirt with a trowel and brush. Archaeologists call these layers of earth strata, and each one is a page in a book where time writes its own version of history. On Crete, those pages reveal sudden shifts, thick spreads of ash, fragments of charred beams, and entire floors collapsed under the weight of fire and stone. To walk a dig site here is to feel as though you are tiptoeing across a frozen moment, one where life stopped mid-step and left behind only husks. At Knossos, the grandest of palaces, archaeologists dig through rubble that tells a story of violence, though whether from nature or human hands is debated endlessly. Some walls lean drunkenly to one side, others have toppled outright, and in many rooms fragments of frescoes lie face down in the dust. Imagine the painted dolphins once leaping joyfully across blue waves now lying broken, as if even they tried to escape. This is not slow decline, it is sudden, brutal interruption. A mainstream historical fact stands out here. Radiocarbon dating and stratigraphic analysis confirm at least 2 distinct destruction layers in several Cretan sites, one of which may align with the eruption of Thera, another with later seismic events or fire. The island seems caught in a cycle of rebuilding and ruin, like a candle that flares gutters and tries again. The soil yields stranger details too. At Phaistos, in a corner of a collapsed room, archaeologists find piles of carbonized grain sealed beneath fallen slabs. The kernels are black and brittle, yet unmistakably barley. To think people once stored these sacks for winter, only for them to become a silent record of catastrophe. If you were hungry, it might be a tragedy. If you are a researcher, thousands of years later it is evidence. And tucked near that same storeroom, a clay seal bears the impression of a leaping bull. Quirky tidbit, some scholars think seals like these served not only as ownership marks, but also as charms, as though stamping a container might guard it from spoilage or theft. Clearly the seal did not protect against earthquakes. Dig deeper and the soil offers glimpses of fire. Charcoal flecks mingle with pottery shards, suggesting sudden conflagrations. Was this the result of oil jars cracking open during a tremor, spreading flames through storerooms? Or did raiders set the blaze deliberately, torches thrown into doorways as villagers fled? Historians still argue whether fire is the fingerprint of nature's chaos or humanity's cruelty. What remains is the same beams, fallen, plaster scorched, and the faint scent of smoke that archaeologists swear sometimes lingers in the earth. There is something intimate about kneeling in these ruins. Imagine brushing dirt from the rim of a cup that once touched someone's lips. The soil records not just catastrophe but daily life: cooking pots, spindle whorls, children's toys. In one layer, a small terracotta figurine of a goddess surfaces, her arms raised in perpetual gesture. Was she meant to protect the household? Did her owners hope she might still the ground beneath their feet? Historians cannot answer, and perhaps she could not either. The layers grow confusing the deeper you go. Floors are built over old ones, walls cut into earlier walls, and pottery styles change like fashion seasons. One moment you find a jug with graceful spirals, a few centimetres lower, a cruder pot with sharp lines. These changes signal shifts in culture, trade, maybe even people. Did newcomers settle here after earlier residents left? Did survivors rebuild in haste, leaving their mark in rougher forms? Scholars debate every centimetre, arguing over whether layers show continuity or replacement. And yet amid this scholarly puzzle, the earth itself feels like a witness reluctant to speak. Archaeologists work slowly, brushing, photographing, cataloguing. They measure ash layers in centimetres and inches, noting that some are thin as a fingernail, others thick as a handspan. One trench may show 10 centimetres, about 4 inches of volcanic dust. Another less than 1 centimetre, about 3/8 of an inch. Such variation suggests uneven fallout, but also uneven survival. Some villages may have been spared, others smothered. The soil knows, but it does not explain. At times, discoveries border on the eerie. In one site, a skeleton lies half buried beneath rubble, one arm outstretched toward a doorway. Was this person fleeing? Were they crushed in a final attempt at escape? Archaeologists record the bones, measure angles, and debate cause of death. But the story lingers in silence. It is not just the bones that move imaginations, it is the gap. There are not many bodies on Crete. For an island supposedly devastated, human remains are surprisingly few. Where did they go? Did they leave before destruction struck hardest? Historians still argue whether the absence of bodies proves a mass exodus, or whether it simply reflects the poor preservation of human remains. Light joke number 1 for this section. An archaeologist once remarked that digging in Crete feels like tidying a teenager's room. You find half-finished projects, sudden messes, and a suspicious amount of broken pottery. Of course, teenagers rarely face earthquakes, but the principle of chaos remains. Every artifact, every soil layer, every charred beam becomes a clue in a mystery that refuses to yield an answer. The earth holds evidence of disaster, but not its cause, traces of flight, but not the full journey. The archaeologist's spade uncovers fragments, imagination stitches them into stories. But imagination can only go so far, and debates rage in conference halls, where scholars raise voices almost as loudly as the ancient quakes themselves. As night falls over modern Crete excavations are covered trenches protected and tools stored. The soil once more closes its secrets, waiting for another dawn, another brush, another patient hand to coax out fragments of its truth. And so the story of Exodus remains partly buried not just in ash and rubble, but in the very silence of the ground. When a people vanish, it is not only their homes and palaces that fall silent, it is their voices. The Cretans leave behind architecture, pottery and frescoes, yet the human stories slip like smoke through broken rafters. What makes this absence all the more haunting is that Greece, later so rich in epic poems, tragedies and histories, remembers Crete mostly in myth. King Minos stalks the pages, the Minotaur snarls in a labyrinth, and Homer drops references like breadcrumbs in his verses. But the farmers, sailors, children and mothers of Crete, their voices are missing. The silence is almost theatrical, as if the chorus never took the stage. Consider the myths that endure. Minos, the great lawgiver, is painted as both wise and tyrannical. The labyrinth with its twisting halls becomes a metaphor for political control or divine punishment. The Minotaur, half man, half bull, reflects both ritual and fear. Yet none of these tales mentions the sudden absence of towns, the broken jars, the abandoned harbours. Instead, they wrap Crete in legend, turning lived catastrophe into symbolic drama. Historians still argue whether later Greeks genuinely forgot the mass departure or deliberately turned it into allegory to suit their storytelling needs. Mainstream history reminds us that Homer's epics describe Crete as populous, boasting many cities. A land with 90 towns, he calls it, hinting at a society brimming with energy. But by the time he sings, many of those towns lie empty or diminished. Did Homer exaggerate? Did he echo an older memory, a story told by travellers who saw Crete in its prime? Or did he know fragments of the truth reshaped into poetry? The debate lingers, and with each reading the gap between myth and archaeology yawns wider. Quirky tidbit, in some later plays Cretans are portrayed as cunning liars, so much so that the phrase Cretan lies becomes proverbial. One philosopher even jokes that all Cretans are liars, creating a paradox that has entertained logicians for centuries. Perhaps the stereotype grew out of the island's mysterious reputation. The people who vanished must have been hiding something right. The irony is sharp, because the only lies that endure are the myths themselves, while the truth remains locked in rubble. Yet the absence of direct testimony is not total. Linear tablets, though undeciphered, do exist. They whisper across the millennia, but in a language we cannot fully read. Imagine holding one in your hand, a small clay rectangle, lines pressed by a stylus. You know it records something important, maybe grain tallies or offerings, maybe even names. But it is a diary in code, a sentence you cannot finish. Historians still debate whether Linear A will ever be cracked, and if it is, whether it will finally tell us what people said about leaving their homes. Until then, it remains like a locked door in the middle of a darkened hallway. Think of how later Greek writers fill the void. They tell of Daedalus, who fashions wings to flee Crete. They tell of Theseus, who sails away after killing the Minotaur, leaving Ariadne behind. All of these are stories of departure, flight, escape. Perhaps they are faint echoes of the real Exodus, embellished, transformed, but rooted in memory. If so, then myth is not a lie, but a distorted reflection like sunlight on rippled water. You can see the shape, but not the detail. Like joke number 1 for this section, if the Cretans really were famous for lies, then perhaps the greatest lie they ever told was convincing history to forget them altogether. It worked too well, even we today struggle to recall the ordinary truths of their lives. The silence also resonates in Homer's omissions. He describes ships, heroes, wars, but where are the voices of Cretan refugees? Did they merge into other cultures so quickly that their identity dissolved? Or did they keep telling stories in corners of the Mediterranean stories that were never written down? Scholars argue, and every conference seems to replay the same question. How does a vibrant culture leave so little trace in the words of its neighbours? Meanwhile, the ruins themselves seem almost theatrical, as if designed to echo with absence. At night, modern travellers wander among columns lit by moonlight, hearing only their footsteps. The walls seem to wait for voices, and none arrive. Some visitors even claim the ruins feel uncanny, as if they listen rather than speak. A romantic notion perhaps, but one that matches the theme. Crete holds its silence like a treasure it refuses to spend. And yet the voices are not completely gone. In Egypt, inscriptions mention Keftiu thought to be Cretans or their descendants. In the Levant pottery styles, echo Cretan designs. These fragments suggest the voices did not die, they simply changed their stage. The absence on the island may mask a chorus, resounding abroad, woven into other languages and traditions. But to us reading backward, it looks like silence. By the time Greece moves into the classical age, Crete's mysteries have already solidified into legend. The island becomes a stage for mythic tales rather than history, its people, characters rather than ancestors, and so the vanished voices fade further like echoes that finally lose their bounce in the hills. What remains are questions layered thick as the ash in abandoned hearths. Who told the last story on Crete before the silence fell? Did someone sing as they boarded the ship, or cry out in anger at the gods? We cannot know, and that is the heart of the mystery. They do not vanish into thin air. When families step onto boats clutching jars, children and charms, they carry their language, habits and fears with them. The great mystery is not only that Crete empties, but where its people go. Scholars sift through clues scattered like breadcrumbs across the Mediterranean, and those clues suggest that Cretans, the Keftiu as Egyptian inscriptions call them, show up in foreign lands, their identities blurred but not erased. Sail down the Nile in the 14th century before the Common Era, and you will find painted scenes on the walls of Theban tombs. There, foreigners arrive bearing gifts, tall, slim figures in patterned kilts, carrying cups, jars, and finely worked goods. Their hairstyles and clothing match what we know from Cretan frescoes. The Egyptians call them Keftiu, a name most scholars link to Crete. It is one mainstream historical fact that anchors the story of wandering Cretans. They appear in Egyptian art not as faceless refugees, but as recognizable traders or emissaries. Whether they come as merchants, diplomats, or migrants seeking safe harbour, their presence proves that Crete's people spread their influence abroad. Archaeological finds reinforce this. In the Levant, pottery shards match Cretan styles down to spiral patterns and marine motifs. In Cyprus, small sanctuaries hold figurines resembling Cretan goddesses. In southern Anatolia, signs of foreign settlers appear, tools, ornaments, and the occasional imported jar. Historians still argue whether these traces reflect permanent migration or merely the wide net of trade. Were these true exiles establishing new homes or only travellers stopping to barter before returning? The debate persists, but the scattered evidence suggests that fragments of Cretan life travel far beyond the island's shores. Quirky tidbit in some Egyptian texts. Foreign dancers are described as leaping in acrobatic displays eerily similar to the bull-leaping frescoes of Knossos. Imagine an Egyptian audience watching these performers somersault through the air, baffled but delighted, while muttering, "Foreigners certainly have odd hobbies." The scene feels like a cultural transplant, one of those little reminders that refugees carry not only goods, but also traditions. For the families themselves, the journeys must have been brutal. Consider the distances from Crete to the Nile Delta is roughly 700 kilometres, about 435 miles of open sea. A ship of the era might stretch 15 to 20 metres long, around 49 to 66 feet, with a cargo capacity of several tons. Crowded with people, animals and jars of food, the voyage is no leisurely cruise. Salt spray stings water skins, must be rationed, and storms can turn decks into chaos. Yet they endure, guided by stars' winds and a stubborn hope that somewhere ahead lies safety. Light joke number 1 for this section: sailors probably told each other the same old joke every night. If Poseidon wanted us to stay on land, he wouldn't have invented seasickness. Laughter helps when your dinner threatens to leap back overboard. As ships land in foreign ports, the wandering Cretans adapt. In Egypt, they may settle in quarters set aside for foreigners blending their skills with local trades. In Cyprus, they contribute to metallurgical networks, their bronze-making expertise valued. In the Levant, they mingle with merchants who speak dozens of dialects, creating a linguistic soup where their own tongue dissolves slowly. Over generations, children may no longer call themselves Cretan, but Egyptian, Cypriot, or Syrian. Yet traces remain in the shape of a jar, in the curve of a dagger, in a song hummed at twilight. Historians still argue whether this scattering represents a desperate refugee flight or a calculated expansion. Some theories suggest that Cretans faced with disaster at home turned exile into opportunity, using their maritime skills to carve new niches abroad. Others see it as survival, only communities fractured, broken, clinging to life wherever waves carried them. The truth may lie between a mixture of ambition and necessity. For those left behind on Crete, the knowledge that neighbours vanished into the horizon must have been chilling. Empty houses, silent workshops, abandoned shrines, each vacancy a reminder that people had chosen to leave rather than endure. Imagine walking through a half-empty village, shutters flapping in the wind, a hearth, cold footprints leading down to the beach and stopping at the waterline. Do you follow, or do you stubbornly stay, hoping the ground will hold steady again? The wandering Cretans become a ghostly presence across the Mediterranean. They are both absent and present, invisible in their homeland, but visible in distant lands. Their goods, Their art, their customs pop up like faint signatures in the margins of other people's stories. They do not disappear. They dissolve and disperse, and in doing so they keep the mystery alive. Because while archaeologists can point to artifacts in Cyprus or depictions in Egypt, they cannot trace the names, the exact journeys, the whispered prayers aboard ships. That part of the story remains beyond the reach of spades and carbon dating. As the sun sets over a foreign harbour, picture a small group of Cretan exiles lighting a fire on shore. They roast fish-share wine from jars they carried and sing songs of the island they left. The notes drift into the night, blending with the local sounds. Their children may not learn the same words, but for one evening, the homeland lingers in flame and melody. The world may forget the details, but the people do not, at least not immediately. It is memory carried on the tongue, even if history forgets to write it down. The farther Cretan ships drift from home harbours, the more their survival depends not on memory, but on exchange. Commerce becomes the soft rope that keeps refugee families tied to one another and to new shores. Wherever they anchor Egypt, Cyprus, the Levant, they carry jars of oil and wine, bronze blades and bright textiles, but also recipes, kiln temperatures, and the knack for turning clay into forms that feel like home. Goods speak for them when words stumble in strange dialects. The objects become interpreters, translating hunger into livelihood. Archaeologists read this story in broken silhouettes. In Levantine ports they lift amphoral, whose clay fingerprints match Cretan workshops. In coastal Syria, spiral motifs curl across sherds like waves that have forgotten the sea. And on Cyprus, shrines cradle figurines with uplifted arms that mirror goddesses once adored in Cretan rooms. A mainstream historical fact is hard to ignore at late Bronze Age sites, such as Enkomi on Cyprus. Cretan-style pottery appears in layers dating to the same centuries that palatial life on Crete falters a pattern that looks less like coincidence and more like movement. Trade is not just object for coin, it is choreography. Picture a family stepping off a boat at dusk, setting 3 amphorae in a neat row. The jars hold 20 to 30 litres each, about 5 to 8 gallons. Thick olive oil glinting at the mouth. Buyers' taste eyebrows rise and bargaining begins. The family is no longer only displaced, they are specialists. A shipwright sees their rope work and hires the father to lash a mast. A weaver admires a patterned band on the mother's shawl and commissions a bolt of cloth. A cook buys oil and returns the next day for more. In a week, strangers call them by name. Across the water in Egypt, painted walls in Theban tombs show foreigners with long, spouted vessels and elegant cups. The Egyptians call them keftiu, a name many scholars link to Crete. Whether they arrive as traders, emissaries or migrants, they appear not as shadows but as recognisable figures carrying a curated Cretan style. Historians still argue whether such scenes celebrate diplomatic theatre or record practical exchange, yet the images anchor the wandering in pigment and plaster. Cretans are on the Nile and their goods move with them. Routes matter as much as markets. From northern Crete to the Nile Delta is roughly 700 kilometres, about 435 miles by sea. A distance that demands a sound hull and a patient captain. A serviceable merchant ship of the era might be 15 to 20 metres long, about 49 to 66 feet, its belly able to hold 2 to 3 metric tons of cargo, about 4,400 to 6,600 pounds if the sea stays generous. Mariners hop island to island, Carpathos roads Cyprus, stealing rest where coves curl their arms around the hull. The work is physical, salty and unglamorous. Survival smells like tarfish and warm rope. Like joke 1 for this section when the sea turns lumpy and stomachs follow, an experienced sailor swears. The best cure is to stare at the horizon and eat a dry crust. A less experienced one swears. The best cure is to dramatically complain until the gods take pity. The goods themselves evolve into passports. In Cyprus, copper leaves the mines as oxhide ingots, rough rectangles with 4 protruding grips each, often weighing 29 to 30 kilograms, about 64 to 66 pounds. Those slabs pair beautifully with Cretan knowledge of casting and finishing. A Cretan smith demonstrating a cleaner pour or a tighter edge earns a seat by the fire and a place in the forge. Quirky tidbits, some ingots and pithoi carry clear thumb swirls where makers pressed clay or metal while turning or lifting. Under raking light you can still see the personal signature. No chisel mark, just a fingerprint baked into time. On trading floors from Ugarit to Memphis, jars lean like quiet salesmen. A buyer thumps a base, listens for a solid ring, and lifts the vessel to judge whether its mass matches the promised contents. Weights and measures become a shared language. A steward's stone may read true to his scale, but the foreigner's reputation is the final calibration. One dishonest paw can close a dozen doors. Light joke 2 arrives as a whisper. A port official claims he can detect watered wine by smell alone. His colleague says he detects it by the shape of the seller's smile. Both insist they are never wrong, and both are wrong exactly as often as the market allows. Not all exchange is coin across a table. In Thebes, gifts serve as diplomacy. In Byblos, marriage binds merchants. In Paphos, temple offerings buy protection for a voyage. A family might part with a single fine stirrup jar in return for a season's anchorage, and the right to sell under a portico's shade. Historians still argue whether the wider Late Bronze Age turbulence collapses these networks or merely reroutes them. One scholar maps dwindling shipments, another maps fresh lines traced by brave or desperate captains. Both maps feel right depending on the year you choose to remember. Shipwrecks keep the receipts. Far to the east, the famous Uluburun wreck goes down in the 14th century, before the Common Era stacked with copper ingots, tin glass, Canaanite jars, ivory and luxury goods, a floating catalogue of exchange. The ship is not necessarily Cretan yet. It demonstrates the dense weave of routes that Cretans sail, proof that even during crisis, the sea is a road busy with traffic. Back on Crete harbours like Komos yield piles of transport amphorae and ship fittings, everyday detritus of a port that once inhaled and exhaled cargo. Together, seabed and shoreline insist on the same truth. Commerce persists, adapts, and sometimes outlives the palaces that first sponsored it. In the bustle of a Levantine market at twilight, the old island returns by sleight of hand. A stool shows a pattern a grandmother in Gurnia would recognise. A bronze awl feels just right in a carpenter's palm. Oil with a peppered bite reminds a homesick mother of a hillside grove. The past survives as texture and taste. Children of the migrants learn new words for old tools, new gods for old gestures. They kneel in temples whose floor plans differ from Knossos, but the rhythm of steps toward an altar feels familiar. Identity, it turns out, can travel by recipe as surely as by boat. Light joke 3, soft as a smile somewhere, a harried merchant groans that foreigners with pretty spirals have made everyone's tableware look plain, and now his aunt refuses to eat stew from a bowl without waves. Culture spreads not with speeches but with errands. What does disappearance mean in such a ledger? If jars, weights, patterns and techniques flourish abroad, is that loss or proof of life? Historians still argue whether the diaspora dilutes Cretan identity into a pale wash, or preserves it in new alloys, half local clay, half island memory. The safest answer is the one the goods themselves propose survival by mixture. The amphora does not cease to be Cretan because it stands in Ugarit. It becomes a bilingual container fluent in 2 markets, 2 kitchens, 2 prayers over dinner. By the time the market's last lamp's gutter commerce has turned exile into routine, the family counts coins, mends a net, and tucks a sleeping child beneath a sail. Tomorrow they will trade again oil for grain, a blade for a berth, a story for a little trust. Their island drifts behind them not as a vanishing, but as a pattern they keep repeating with their hands. If the palaces were the official archives of Crete, the goods are the people's footnotes, portable and persuasive. And as long as footnotes remain legible, the main text cannot truly be lost. Stone remembers what people forget. Across Crete, palaces and fortresses stand like empty shells, their staircases leading nowhere, their walls exposed to sky. These places once pulsed with music markets and commands. Now they lie quiet, wind curling through cracked corridors, owls nesting in broken beams. The silence is not just the absence of sound, it is the echo of abandonment. To walk these ruins today is to step into the outline of lives that stopped abruptly. Knossos, the largest palace, sprawls over a maze of courtyards and rooms. Once a centre of administration and ritual, its halls smell now only of dust. Archaeologists note multiple phases of destruction and rebuilding here, each leaving its scar. A mainstream historical fact anchors this: at least 2 major conflagrations scar Knossos, separated by intervals of reconstruction. The walls tell of fire so hot that stones crack and plaster melts. Yet amid these scars one still finds frescoes leaping. Dolphins, dancers and acrobats over bulls bright enough to suggest resilience. Rebuild, repaint resume, until one day they do not. Elsewhere, smaller fortresses stand empty. On ridges overlooking valleys, towers squat like watchful eyes. They once guarded trade routes and signalled warnings with fire, yet many show signs of rapid abandonment. Storerooms contain broken pithoi granaries lie half-filled, and staircases end in collapsed rubble. Were they deserted in panic, or did inhabitants leave in an orderly procession? Historians still argue whether invaders forced flight, or if repeated disasters drained communities until they simply walked away. The evidence is ambiguous: no great piles of weapons, no mass graves, only deserted rooms and ash layers. A quirky tidbit surfaces at Malea, where archaeologists found a large stone block with curious cup-shaped depressions. Some suggest it served as a board for games, others as a ritual altar. Imagine soldiers once passing time by dropping stones into hollows, laughter bouncing off walls that centuries later crumble into silence. If it was a game, the final move is forever suspended. Palaces and fortresses are more than stone, they are metaphors. They embody power, wealth, and security. Their collapse shouts louder than any inscription. When a fortress gate falls from its hinges, it does not whisper. It declares the end of order. Imagine being a villager climbing a hill to see the fortress. Tower you trusted standing, cracked its fire signal platform abandoned. The message is clear: the Guardians have gone. You are on your own. Like joke number 1 for this section, archaeologists often nickname these sites after modern conveniences: the pantry, the throne room, the bathroom, but sometimes the labels say more about the digger's imagination than the ancient reality. Somewhere a Cretan king is laughing that his sacred chamber is now called storage closet number 2. At Phaistos, the palace terrace gazes over fertile plains. Excavations reveal collapsed staircases and charred beams. Yet scattered around are tools left mid-use chisels, loom weights and cups. This is not ceremonial abandonment. It looks like interruption. Imagine weaving halfway through a cloth and then dropping the shuttle forever. The thread trails off like the story itself. Historians still debate whether such sudden desertions stem from earthquake fire or enemy assault. Each theory finds fragments to support it, but none explains all the ruins at once. Smaller hilltop forts known as peak sanctuaries also stand deserted. These shrines once gathered villagers for rituals, offerings of clay figurines, and prayers whispered to mountain winds. Excavators find hundreds of tiny votive limbs, clay arms, legs, and eyes meant as petitions for healing. Quirky tidbit: one cache contained clay models of feet with exaggerated toes, as though ancient worshippers worried their sandals pinched or their bunions ached. Now those votives lie buried in silence, their prayers unanswered. The physical emptiness of fortresses creates a psychological one. Imagine walking through a palace courtyard with no footsteps but your own. The absence becomes heavy pressing, like a hand on your shoulder. Even centuries later, tourists describe a strange hush, as though the ruins themselves resist noise. Perhaps the Cretans who remained felt it too, the uncanny realization that spaces meant for thousands now sheltered none. Like joke number 2. One modern visitor remarked that Knossos felt like a university campus in summer grand halls, endless staircases, but nobody there to answer questions. History, like academia, often takes vacations at inconvenient times. Archaeologists measure these ruins carefully. Walls 2 meters thick, about 6.5 feet staircases, rising 4 meters, about 13 feet courtyards, stretching 30 meters across about 98 feet. These dimensions speak of ambition and permanence, yet permanence proves an illusion. What once seemed unshakable collapses, reminding us that stone lasts only slightly longer than people. Historians still argue whether the final abandonment of these sites is sudden or gradual. Some propose dramatic invasions, the arrival of Mycenaeans from the mainland storming palaces and taking control. Others suggest slow erosion, earthquakes weaken walls, trade dwindles, faith falters, and eventually leaders no longer command followers. The silence we see today may be the result of decades, not days. Like joke number 3, if you ask the ruins themselves what happened, they would probably reply, "We're keeping it vague so historians stay employed." The stones have mastered job security. As the sun dips, shadows lengthen across the empty courts. The fortresses that once promised safety now tell only of rendings. They are guardians who abandoned their post monuments that turned into mausoleums. To walk among them is to hear silence speaking louder than drums, telling of a people who left without writing down why. The ruins whisper one stark sentence, but the scholars who gather around them speak in a chorus of competing theories. Each idea sounds persuasive in the moment, until another expert lifts a different shard, cites a different layer of ash, and turns the argument on its head. The truth keeps slipping like water poured into cupped hands, finding every gap and running away before anyone can hold it. Down in the trenches, the evidence sits patiently: charred beams, toppled walls, pithoi split like huge clay eggs. while in lecture halls voices rise and notebooks fill. Somewhere between soil and symposium, the why of Crete's emptying remains maddeningly unfinished. One camp points to nature as the blunt instrument. Earthquakes rattle the palaces again and again, and across the sea the volcano on Thera throws a tantrum that darkens skies and unsettles coasts. A mainstream historical fact steadies this view. Stratigraphic layers on Crete preserve marine sands well inland, and radiocarbon windows align at several sites with the mid-second millennium before the Common Era, exactly when that eruption shakes the region. Fields salted by waves fail, harbours choke on wreckage, and faith in steady ground erodes. The counter-argument delivered with a patient shrug asks why other quake-ridden places recover, while Crete falters so dramatically. The answer, if there is one, refuses to sit still. Another faction points to human hands from across the wine-dark sea. Mycenaeans, armed with different scripts and different palatial habits, appear in the record at Knossos clay tablets in Linear B, the mainland's administrative Greek turn-up in levels that follow destruction. Did those northerners storm in behind battered gates or stroll through doors left open by catastrophe? Historians still argue whether we should call it conquest caretaker rule or simple opportunism. The walls, 2 meters thick, about 6.5 feet in places, suggest someone planned for strength. The burned stairways suggest strength was not enough. Power like plaster holds beautifully until the day it cracks. A third lens watches the pantry, not the throne room. If tsunamis salted soils and ash drift thinned harvests, a famine math sets and granaries empty faster than they fill. Storerooms lose their reassuring smell of oil and grain, and neighbours begin to count one another's jars. Archaeologists have found pithoi in collapsed rooms with content spoiled or gone, and half-finished tools abandoned where a good year would have finished them. Remember that salt line we traced earlier in the fields, 300 to 400 metres, roughly 980 to 1,310 feet inland? Turn that invisible border into a yearly worry, and you get families weighing the sea against the soil. Historians still argue whether scarcity alone can empty cities. Scarcity combined with shaking ground starts to sound like a plan to leave. Religion enters as both balm and accelerant. The island's rituals, from bull-leaping thrills to quiet offerings at peak sanctuaries, bond communities, but they also make promises the gods will steady the earth, rain will come, the sea will behave. When promises fail, priests lose authority and worry spreads like a low fire through dry grass. At Anemospilia, the frozen tableau of bodies in a collapsed structure has long fueled debate. Were those people caught in an earthquake mid-ritual, or does the arrangement hint at sacrifice? Quirky tidbit, one early interpretation even imagined a knife poised near a bound figure, a dramatic scene fit for a tragic stage. Later rereadings cooled the theatrics, but could not silence the question. Historians still argue whether religious disillusion becomes the quiet fuse that burns under politics and trade. Trade networks widen the frame until Crete is one island in a stormy archipelago of troubles. Across the eastern Mediterranean in the late Bronze Age, Ugarit writes frantic letters and then burns Hittite power-thins at the edges, and Egyptian records grumble about marauders, later nicknamed the Sea Peoples. In this mess of overturned routes, Cretan ships ferry oil skills and hope along lanes that suddenly feel less like roads and more like risks. The famous Uluburan shipwreck, no, not a Cretan vessel for sure, but a floating ledger of the time, lies on the seabed with copper tin glass and jars stacked like arguments for how dense and delicate the old system was. Like joke number 1, when an inscription says the raiders came from the midst of the sea, every student writes in the margin, "Yes, thank you, extremely helpful," and the professor smiles a tired smile. Illness lurks at the edges of the conversation, too polite to prove itself, but too plausible to dismiss. Tsunami ponds breed mosquitoes, malnutrition lowers defences, strangers mingle in crowded ports, and fevers travel faster than letters. Bones sometimes show stress lines from childhood hunger. Direct traces of plague remain elusive. Still, one can imagine leaders losing their grip as households juggle tremors, thin harvests, and coughs that will not quit. Like joke number 2, whispered for courage, an elder claims his knees predict disaster better than oracles. His neighbour says the knees predict rain arthritis, and when the last loaf is ready. Both men insist they are right, because in hard times certainty is a comfort food. Some scholars drop the hunt for a single villain and sketch a cascade, instead a Swiss cheese model, before there was Switzerland or anyone slicing cheese. Several layers of defence, thick walls, deep stores, trustworthy gods, friendly harbours, stable trade, each carry small holes. Most years the holes do not align. Then in a bad decade they do. A quake knocks storerooms, a wave salts fields, A festival fails to lift spirits. A neighbour with ships and sharp elbows arrives. Trade routes flicker. A fever moves through households already tired. The result is not a theatrical collapse, but a long sigh that ends at the waterline. Historians still argue whether this many small-cut story explains too much or finally makes the puzzle feel human. A different, gentler argument gives the Cretans back their agency. Perhaps the Exodus is not a failure, but a choice made by good readers of bad weather. The families we watched earlier, bundles ready knives for omens quietly used to cut cheese goats, boarding ships without permission, look less like victims and more like navigators. They take recipes, rope work, and the fashion for spirals on bowls, and sail toward places where those skills translate into food, coin, and friends. Quirky tidbit to tuck beside that idea thumb, swirls left in clay, and little production quirks show up abroad like accents that never quite fade. Disappearance in this telling is a new name for survival. Meanwhile, method itself becomes a theory. Radiocarbon dates prefer windows to pinpoints. Potsherd styles drift with traders as much as with migrants. A rebuilding phase might signal resilience or a new elite with different paperwork. Historians still argue whether our categories collapse. Conquest, abandonment flatten years into slogans that stones do not recognize. The earth remembers events. We remember stories, and stories are tidier than earthquakes. Light joke number 3. Soft as a smile. If Crete were a mystery novel, scholars would have accused the volcano, the Mycenaeans, the priests, the merchants, the mosquitoes, and the goat especially. The goat and the author would still refuse to reveal the culprit before the final page. But this tale has no last page, only long margins where we write our best guesses. The palaces keep their cracked silence. The forts on the ridges continue to stare down empty valleys, and the harbours hold the memory of hulls that pointed away at dawn. Whether the first domino is fire, wave hunger, sword fever, or fear, the line of falling pieces ends in the same place, ships sliding past the headlands, families looking back once and then only see. When the dust settles and centuries pass, what remains of the Cretan Exodus is not a diary, not a proclamation, but a shadow that seeps into legend. The people themselves are gone, their voices hushed, yet their absence leaves an imprint that later cultures fill with story. Myths grow where records should stand, sprouting like vines across broken walls. The mystery of departure of a bustling island slipping into silence ripples outward and enters the bloodstream of Mediterranean memory. Later, Greek writers do not describe carts rolling toward harbours or jars rattling in ships' holds. Instead, they speak of kings, monsters, and gods. The labyrinth becomes a central image, a maze in which a monstrous hybrid lurks half man and half bull, defeated only by cunning. Historians still argue whether the labyrinth is a dim recollection of sprawling palaces with twisting halls, or a metaphor for power that traps its people. Either way, the myth transforms architectural memory into allegory. In the absence of plain explanation, imagination steps in. The figure of Minos, stern judge and lawgiver, stalks through these tales. In Homer's Odyssey, Minos appears in the underworld, still dispensing judgment beyond death. Such persistence of his name hints at the lasting weight of Cretan authority, even as the society that produced it had already faded. Quirky tidbit, some later Greeks joked that Minos must have been a terrible neighbour, if even the afterlife could not silence his rulings. Myth makes him eternal while his subjects vanish nameless. Other echoes surface in the tales of Daedalus and Icarus. Daedalus, master craftsman, fashions wings so he and his son may flee Crete. The flight, the fall, the feathers drifting over the sea. This story too may echo the reality of departure. Families really did take to the sea though, without wax and feathers. The myth distills hardship into parable, ingenuity offers escape. But escape carries risk. Historians still argue whether these myths are deliberate transformations of memory or coincidence shaped by universal themes of loss and ambition. Light joke number 1. If you tried to explain to an ancient Cretan farmer that his family's forced migration would one day inspire stories about a boy flying too close to the sun, he might reply, "That sounds poetic, but I'll settle for a boat that doesn't leak." The myths of Theseus and the Minotaur also resonate with undertones of departure. Theseus sails to Crete, defeats the monster, and sails away again, leaving Ariadne abandoned. Departure defines the narrative, not settlement. Ships glide away, stories end with sails against the horizon. To later audiences, Crete is not remembered as a land of arrival, but of leaving of unfinished business. This mirrors the archaeological silence palaces, emptied ports, abandoned families gone. By the Byzantine era, Crete becomes a different kind of mystery. Legends tell of emperors hiding treasures in mountain caves, of saints battling demons on its cliffs, of a last king who sleeps beneath the earth, awaiting return. These later layers fold onto the earlier silence, turning Crete into a palimpsest of departures and expected returns. What was once exodus becomes prophecy. One day a hidden leader will come back. Myths continue the theme of absence shaping presence. Historians still argue whether myth preserves kernels of memory or simply satisfies the human need for story. Perhaps both. People hate gaps, so they fill them. They hate silence, so they sing over it. The departure from Crete becomes less about jars on ships and more about symbols, labyrinths, monsters, wings, treasures. The factual exodus dissolves, but its ghost lingers in every retelling. Like joke number 2 for this section. Somewhere in Athens, a playwright probably muttered, "I need a plot twist." Let's use Crete. Nobody will check the details, they all left anyway. Audiences clapped and the island's fate transformed into box office myth. Even modern scholarship wrestles with this tension. Archaeologists carefully date ash layers and debate tsunami deposits, while the general public still pictures the Minotaur lurking in a maze. Which version is truer, the broken walls or the enduring myth? Both tell us something, though in different tongues. The ruins say people left, and we do not know why. The myths say people left, and we cannot stop wondering. Quirky tidbit number 3. Victorian travellers enchanted by Homer and eager for romance sometimes sketched ruins as if they were labyrinths, drawing corridors that never existed, letting desire sculpt evidence. Even in modern times, Crete's mystery tempts the imagination to embellish. As the night deepens, picture the island itself lying in the Mediterranean like a sleeper. Its mountains hold caves where shepherds once lit lamps. Its valleys cradle ruins where frescoes still gleam faintly. The exodus, the silence, the myths, they all merge here. Crete is a riddle written in ash, rebuilt in stone, retold in poetry. Its people scattered, its palaces broken, yet its story still wanders. Like joke number 3, perhaps the truest myth is that anyone will ever agree on what happened. If historians one day solve the riddle completely, Crete might feel less alive. Maybe the island prefers to stay mysterious, keeping its scholars busy and its visitors leaning in close to listen. So the mass departure becomes not just an event, but a legend shaping Greek imagination and echoing through time. In the end, the Cretans vanish from their island, but not from history. They leave behind puzzles that no earthquake, no invasion, no famine can erase. The silence itself becomes their monument. The journey of Crete's forgotten exodus now draws to its close, and with it the restless energy of mystery begins to soften. The voices we chase through ruins and myths grow faint, and the harbours that once shook with the sound of departure are still again lulled by waves that have repeated their rhythm for thousands of years. The silence that puzzled archaeologists, the gaps that fueled scholars' quarrels, now become something gentler, a lullaby of unanswered questions. You can almost hear it in the rustle of olive branches at night, in the steady hush of tide against the shore. Let the picture fade slowly. Imagine the courtyards of Knossos no longer crowded with dancers or scribes, but washed in silver moonlight stones cool beneath drifting air. The labyrinth is empty, its passages echoing only with the quiet sigh of wind. Farther inland, the hills sleep under stars, their caves hiding stories that will never be fully told, and beyond them the sea eternal and patient, keeping the secrets of those who once crossed it with jars, children and fragile hope. As you sink into rest, let the mystery dissolve into calm. You need not solve the riddle tonight, nor untangle the debates of scholars. It is enough to drift with the rhythm of the waves, to feel the hush of forgotten footsteps on abandoned paths, to know that history does not always give answers, but often gives peace in the search itself. Every unanswered question becomes a candle guttering out, leaving only the warmth of its glow. So close your eyes, let your breathing lengthen, and allow the island's stillness to become your own. The past is quiet now, and it offers you its silence as a gift.